Good afternoon, everybody. Yesterday was International Human Rights Day, so it's very fitting this week to have this conversation. Thank you for the Centre for Future Generations for including this perspective on human rights, because including it already at this, groundbreaking event is really essential and sends all the right signals for us today. I'm going to echo some of the key messages of our UN High Commissioner for Human Rights yesterday in reminding us just why human rights are so important as this crucial crossroads for humanity. We talk about future generations, but it's our past generations who fought really hard for our human rights. Some even died for our human rights, our right to protest, our right to participate, our right to freely express ourselves and live together, and a right to live in a peaceful world. And obviously, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed 76 years ago, yesterday, in Paris. It is quite daunting when we look around at the world we see today, and yet still, with my work that I do at the Office of High Commissioner and that global view of communities all over the world, it gives me hope to see how human rights remains a source of empowerment, of mobilization and community, and a framework that can point us in the right direction for a better world. And the area of technology, of course, is no exception to that. Today, I want to speak to that. We have a room of very esteemed leaders in the area, technologists, scientists, fellow lawyers. For me, the real appeal today that I'd like to convince you is just how important that human rights lens and focus will be in our conversations about global digital governance. A few weeks ago in New York, all of the nations of the world gathered and agreed on the Global Digital Compact. It's remarkable nowadays that they agreed on anything. But something they did agree upon, and something that gives me hope, and hope is certainly something we need at the moment, is that they agreed that digital governance would be grounded and anchored in international human rights law. But it will be up to all of us in our efforts, internationally, nationally, to make sure that this is the case and to hold both governments and companies to account in making this a reality. I also want to talk today about the future, but also the present. Because the thing about human rights is that it gives us an opportunity to look at both. We need to examine carefully and consider the injustices that technology creates today in order to be well prepared for the future eventualities and the future progressions. And I just want to take a moment to give some examples of how technology is actually creating some injustices or causing human rights challenges, and emphasizing how addressing these shortcomings today will be so important to make sure that we do have a future where technology serves humanity. The first area I want to look at is the area of artificial intelligence, which I know has been subject to a workshop earlier today and is a key area of concern. The challenge that we have, and in fact, it's been borne by the shoulders of impacted communities who've done the leader scholarship in this area, is that we have seen and again how AI can perpetuate bias and discrimination. And it does this in a number of ways, three of which I want to go into a little bit of detail on. One is representation. If we ask a generative AI tool today, show me a picture of a leader, the chances are the picture that will appear will be white and male. There's also more nefarious uses where very stereotypical images or harmful images of certain communities appear. And that's because, of course, the building blocks of some of those AI systems have been narrowly built and are focused on just one part of the world where we have a dominant groups that are predicting the data input. Also in decision making, we see this happening again and again for discrimination. When you think about it, AI is being used to make decisions of crucial importance to our lives. It's being used to decide if an asylum seeker might actually get their right to asylum realized. That can be a question of life or death for some people. It might be decided about whether you get access to a certain place of school, whether or not you get a mortgage, whether you can have a home. These are fundamental decisions, and obviously they're all linked clearly to core human rights: the right to adequate standard of living, the right to housing, the right to be free from discrimination. I also like, as a human rights lawyer, to say, let's not talk about bias, let's talk about the actionable right to be free from discrimination. I experienced this myself not too long ago, where my youngest child was being registered for preschool. The public authority who was doing the registration told me, "Don't worry, the system is very fair because the computer decides who gets the place at school." And said this totally unironically, which really struck me at the extent of awareness that we have across public authorities and government to realize this. Of course, having studied these matters in detail, I know that that's not true. I know that they use things like location to decide, proximity to the school to decide. But we all know that location is a proxy for economic and social status. Children that might be in social housing, therefore, and further away, will be discriminated several times over. We've seen the same in recruitment. One of the most famous cases, of course, is that a recruitment system actually delisted women because it viewed the period of maternity leave as being less productive. Now, let me tell you something. Not only is that discriminatory, it's also wrong, because if you ask anybody with any sense, they'll tell you a working mom is the person who's going to get everything done and on time. So these are really very serious questions that are perpetuating in different ways. And the final point on discrimination is on prediction and on profiling. And this, to those of us who are older to remember, is like the real-life Minority Report. The idea that a system that, again, has been trained, a justice system that has been trained on not even convictions that have been through rule of law, checks and balances, but systems that have been trained actually on just the profiling systems themselves. So been trained on suspects being used to predict who would be innocent or guilty, totally undermining the presumption of innocence. So these are a lot of the ways. Now, we know that there are regulations such as the EU's AI Act that do provide us some of the framework, but there is still a gap between those international standards and the promise that they hold and the reality of some of the different regulatory conversations that we're having. I wanted to just touch on one of them. First of all, to emphasize that we need a rights-based approach to technical governance. And what does that mean? We've seen a lot about risk-based approaches, but sometimes a risk-based approach is looking at, for example, security concerns at our borders, or maybe might think that because there's a risk of security, that we should therefore permit pervasive facial recognition technology in a crowd. But the human rights perspective, of course, tells us that such widespread mass surveillance can never be compatible with individual freedoms and would have a terrible, almost dystopian impact on our society, our ability to organize and protest. So we really need to put a rights-based approach, which is actually the impact on people approach, first and foremost in our thinking. We also need to move away from what we've been seeing globally, blanket exemptions for national security. Again, as somebody who's worked for many years in human rights in different jurisdictions across the world, I can unfortunately tell you that it's the most egregious human rights violations that happen in the context of national security. We shouldn't be exempting these situations. We should be insisting on those safeguards, especially in the use of technology. We also need to have mandatory transparency. Going back to the example of discrimination again, I have a right not to be discriminated in my access to education, in my access to a job. But if I don't know that AI has been used, how can I even challenge the fact that this decision has been taken against me? And of course, if the person deploying it does not even know how it works, so the problem continues. So human rights provide us with really clear rights, but to make them actionable, we do need to take further steps. Circling back to where I began this conversation on AI is to say, well, why do these matters today matter for the future? Because when we are technologically advancing, we are constantly building on what's already there, expanding it. If there's discrimination inbuilt into our systems today, if we add in quantum computing, we power up generative AI, those will be exponentially exploded and have even further consequences. So really taking those actions today about mandatory transparency, about a rights-based approach. And I must say that a human rights-based approach necessarily has to include the possibility of prohibition. Because if we conclude that the use of a certain technology in a context, its risk is too great to our society or to humans, then the logical consequence would be that a moratorium be placed until regulations are in place, or that we prohibit that completely. And that has to be on the table for a human rights-based approach. That's some of the examples from artificial intelligence. There are many more, of course. When it comes to surveillance, we look at the topic. Again, I've spoken about how facial recognition technology has been used. We're also looking at the advances in quantum computing, which say that encryption could be very quickly undermined. End-to-end encryption is essential for human rights defenders, for journalists, actually for our entire society. We all know that without the ability to communicate securely, that really can undermine our society. And debates on encryption, again, are happening today and being fought today. Even here in the European Union, unfortunately, there are some member states that are pushing to undermine it. So whilst it might not seem obvious, getting involved in those debates today are extremely important to protect for our future. And finally, just concludingly, I think the point about online expression is extremely important. Again, in my work, I look at platform regulation, how we organize online, not just in Europe, but globally. And we need to remember that there are different powers at play. We can't make the Eurocentric presumption that a government is always well-intended. So regulating even social media companies in some jurisdictions can actually cause more harm than good. At the same time, we can't let social media companies away without being accountable. And that causal link of when their business practices cause harm needs to be held account. These are complex questions, but I'm convinced that the international human rights framework carries us a real possibility of a way forward. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, there could be so much more, and I look forward to the conversations. My real appeal today is that we take up that challenge as agreed by the Global Digital Compact, to end digital divides, to protect people's rights, and most of all, to work together to use human rights as an instrument that technology works for the good, not the bad of humanity. Thank you.